Hi, everybody. Welcome back to the Strength Club podcast. This is going to be part two of our programming series. Programming series is going to be the paternity leave project for me. I'm taking a break from in-person coaching, apparently till like midway through December. And then in this time, my goal is to get out a more comprehensive series on programming. Last week, we started with how workouts are too long. Just for most people, they're too long, and how that really stops most people. Basically the TLDR for that video was that most people who stop training, it's solely a factor of time. They run out of time. They say, hey, I'm making these gains, but the whole process is too slow. I'm having to work out for an hour and 40 minutes 3 times a week. I can't do that sort of commitment. I have 3 kids. I run 2 businesses, whatever it is. They're doing the Sigma grind 12 hours a day. They don't have the time to work out. So we started the programming series off with, your workouts are too long, how to condense a workout effectively. This one we're going to do sort of like the 5 primary themes behind why people essentially just ruin their own progress. We have a pretty clearly laid out pathway to progress through starting strength, the novice linear progression, when I say starting strength, not the company. And then we have through practical programming, and we have all these sort of intermediate tools that we know about, we being kind of like the greater starting strength, or that's sort of like practical programming, lifting sphere. But there are a lot of pitfalls that people fall into. We're going to cover the big 5 ones this time, and then afterwards we're going to probably expand on the first one the most, as that's really where most people are going to get hitched up on. And then we'll see what that is. Today's edition is going to be the Democratic People's Republic of Texas. We have Chase's info. I'm just keeping this in here forever. Here's my website. I'm available for coaching in-person work in the DC area. I'll be starting and doing in-person again, probably midway through December. We'll see how the holidays work out. Could be January. 2 of my favorite quotes. And then here we go. Right. I'm going to do a quick summary for these 5, and then we'll dig into each one of them. Here are the top 5 ways that you probably screw up your programming. The first one, and this is the biggest one, is going to be getting greedy. And this is going to be people who are riding that high off of the starting strength linear progression. And they're like, hey, 5 pounds a week is what I should be getting. I'm an intermediate by definition, which means 5 pounds a week. That's it. That's all I can do. Anything less than that is abject failure. And then you'll even see people who are into intermediate programming, for whatever that means, who are like 6 months in, they're a year in, and they're still thinking, 5 pounds every other session is something that's reasonable. The second one is going to be the technique people, thinking that it's technique, the people who do lighter work for form. Steph had a really good article on this. I feel like it was 1 year ago, but it could be 1 to 3 years ago at this point. The people who are constantly obsessing about how the movement looks itself, and then they sandbag their own work tremendously. So basically, we're going to talk about how to manage those people. If you're one of those people, you can extrapolate that to yourself. The third are the people who are married to the novice linear progression. I think the record that I have for this one is going to be, I think someone was trying the NLP for about 2 years, or a little bit over 2 years. Nick, I think that is you, actually. Nick from Vegas, shout out to you, Nick, if you're watching this one. But he was telling me that he was still doing sets of 5 on progression for his deadlift. His deadlift was at like 300 some pounds at the time. And I was like, okay, all right. And then send me a video. We'll see how it looks. And I get the video, and it's literally like 4.5 minutes long. And then he was doing 1 rep, resting like a minute and a half, doing another rep, resting like a minute, doing another rep, and so on and so forth. And then he was like, hey, that still counts as a set of 5. I never took my hands off the bar. There are people who milk the NLP to like the nth degree. They'll think, hey, I want to be a novice. I want to be a novice forever. I should be able to get 5 pounds a workout, things like that. And they'll just grind themselves to dust. A lot of people, they don't realize that the NLP is something that can last literally 2 months for someone. It can last 4 months for someone else, and 6 months for the third person. So we'll talk about those people, how to avoid that pitfall. The fourth one are people who are constantly changing things, constantly changing either technical changes, programming changes. They're changing what their goals are. Depending on what podcast they listen to. 1 week they may be LARPing as a Navy SEAL. The next week they may want to be a bow hunter. The third week they may be trying to biohack, trying to sun their balls in the morning. Number 4, I would say that's the most common one on the internet right now. The sort of like internet fitness bro who's just sort of hyper obsessed with fitness. They end up falling into number 4. And I think number 5, the fear of failure or injury, this is probably your most like normal person. If you're just going to take like your sum of normal dudes in the United States, people who start doing fitness, chances are they're going to fall into number 5. A lot of these people, Maybe they hurt their knee doing track in high school. Maybe they did, maybe they fell down the stairs when they were like 30 and they tweaked their back. They're 45 now. And then every time their back aches, they're like, oh, well, I did have that one injury. You remember that? Unless your arm literally came off your body and they put it back on, chances are those injuries aren't really a big deal. So we'll go over number 5 too. But I think number 5, if you're consuming internet fitness content, particularly informational stuff like this, you're probably not number 5. Chances are you're somewhere between number 1 and number 4. But here we go. We'll dig into the greedy people. We got to lay out a few things. Number 1, what is a normal progress rate? And then to figure out what is normal, we kind of have to extrapolate that across time. So if we think 3 workouts a week, let's go back to assess NLP days, novice linear progression days. And then we're thinking, hey, I gained 15 pounds on my squat this week. We have 50 some weeks in a year. How long is that going to last? Not really that long. Or if it did, you'd be squatting, 500 pounds, you'd be the coolest guy in the world. But that very rarely happens. People will train for, 5-6 years and not get that total. Now let's say if we say you're taking 10 pounds a week, you still have 50 weeks in a year, you're still getting, 500 pounds in your lifts? Probably not. We take it down to 5. Is that a little bit more reasonable? Kind of not. Really what it's going to be, something that's very reasonable for an intermediate, is like 5 pounds every 2 weeks, every 2.5 weeks, depending on who you are. We did another one, me and the baby. This was just me. This wasn't me and the baby this time. Probably, I think it was 3 episodes ago, talking about strength expectations for normal human beings. And then the short version of the TLDR for that one was that a lot of people who are giving you lifting advice on the internet, if you kind of clue into their own history, they're going to be like, oh yeah, I pulled 500 in my first year, or I pulled 550, or oh, I got 6 plates on my deadlift, I got 6 or somewhere around the point within like 1.5 to 2 years. There are people who they've really survived the game. They're probably more athletic than not, and they could be 1.5 standard deviations above the mean. You may be a standard deviation below the mean, and then for you, 315 is something that takes 2.5 years to get to. So that guy who is consuming fitness content may be 1 standard deviation below the mean, who's no shit, honestly, it could take him 2.5 years to get to 315. He could be consuming the same Andrew Huberman podcasts about, doing whatever sort of biohacking, rubbing broccoli stems in the back of your ears. He may be doing and consuming that same sort of fitness content that the guy who pulled 500 in his first year. And then these are going to like wildly influence their opinions on what's normal and what's not, because essentially when we're browsing Instagram, we're browsing our fitness content, we're seeing all these people who are like far right end of the spectrum, on success in this realm. Okay. They may be dumb as bricks. They may be terribly ugly, whatever, but they're really good at lifting weights. You're seeing all of those people. You may not be even close to them. Okay. That may be like a chess master looking at someone in their 9th grade chess club. There may be that big of a difference in skill. So in terms of these expectations, almost everyone, including myself, we have wildly high expectations as to what we should be able to gain, so people, when you're saying, hey, I should be getting 5 pounds a session on a lift, that lasts a few months. 5 pounds a 5 pounds a week, that lasts another few months. Notice that we're still under a year. Chances are we're under 9 months even at this point. Okay. Now you may be able to think like, okay, well, like on my rack pull, let's say I'm doing deadlifts, my deadlift stall, I introduce a rack pull. Be able to take 5 pounds a week on your rack pull, so on and so forth. But if we're doing like an earnest 1x5 or a, earnest 3x5 PR, if we're sticking to 5s, most human beings are not going to be able to sustain 5 pound increases on that a week for over a year, really at all. And then for you, fitness viewer who's watching this, including myself, we've been lifting for years. I've been lifting for over 10 years. He hasn't started lifting at all. You may be lifting for 3 years and you still think 3 years in that you should be getting 5 pounds a week on your progress. Okay. So these people, they tend to be prone to injury and then actual injury, not just sort of pain, and then prone to failure, right? Because they're really pushing the pace, kind of pedal to the metal. They may not be lifting very intensely. It may not look like West Side. It may not look like a high school, wrestling or high school football weight room where they're just like, spitting blood, trying as hard as they can. Everybody's pissing themselves. They're trying so hard, it's unreal. They may not even be doing that, but they're putting so much weight on the bar at such a rapid pace that it's wildly overshooting what's reasonable. These are a lot of people who during their NLPs, they'll be, even if it's not a squat guard problem, they'll get knee problems, lower back problems, elbow problems. Let's say their form is even fine, but it's just from exceeding their body's capacity really, really early. And then the same thing with failure. If someone's coming to you and they're saying, hey, I'm on my NLP and then I failed, let's say 12 weeks into it, you're okay. 12 weeks, that's like, they shouldn't have failed at that point. And they may have taken 10 pound jumps for way too long. And they may still be trying 5-pound jumps. They may be still trying to deadlift 3 times a week. This is when we refer back to Rip's 3 questions article. So all of this is assuming that you can answer those 3 questions. Those being eating and sleeping enough. Are you taking conservative enough jumps in terms of increases weight on the bar? And then are you resting for long enough in between sets? Assuming that we have all those things. This sort of the greedy concept here is for people who are thinking, I absolutely deserve and demand to be gaining 5 pounds a week on all of my lifts, even though I've been lifting for a year and a half. Whereas in reality, that's just like wildly unreasonable, because like if you look at someone who's been lifting for 10 years, like myself, actually over 10 years now, is it, if I didn't gain 5 pounds a week on my lifts, would that mean I'm a failure? Not at all. Otherwise, anyone who's 40 and they started when they were 20, they have 20 pounds or 20 years under their belt. Everybody should be pulling 800 pounds. That's not at all true. So next episode, we're going to really dig into this. What is a normal rate of progress? And then how you can differentiate when you're being greedy in programming and your programming is failing versus when your programming is actually still succeeding, but you just have overly high expectations. And then this one, the big thing about this one, the sort of the greedy archetype for programming, it's going to be the blame game. A lot of people who are very greedy in programming, they will immediately rush technique. They're like, oh man, it's probably the fact that I'm not taking enough creatine. Oh, it's probably the fact that I slept for 6.5 hours as opposed to 7 hours. Oh, it's probably the fact that somebody cut me off in traffic. They'll really start pulling reasons, anything that they can do to rationalize why they did not get another 5 pounds on their bench this week on their top, Texas method set of 5 or what have you. And then that can cause a lot of problems on its own, because essentially what you need to do is realize that programming more often than not is the thing you can change the most. So it's really hard, like with him. Like, I can't really change how much I'm sleeping right now. It's kind of hard to change how much or what sort of things that I'm eating. It's kind of hard to change all of these things, stress at work, all that stuff. The things that we can change, the lever that we can really pull constantly, that's going to be programming. So more often than not, the people who are really greedy in terms of rates of progress, they'll be really reluctant to admit or at least acknowledge or even understand that, hey, the problem in this scenario is the programming, and we'll go over how to fix that in future episodes. But chances are this may be you, so if it does sound like you, let me know. The opposite of these guys, these are the technique weenies. These are the people who are constantly doing everything really low RPE. They're constantly obsessed about their form. These people, if I'm working with them online, I'll say like, hey, film, your first and your last set, and they'll film all 5 or 6 sets, and they'll watch every single set in between. They'll be, doing their lift and like, oh, I didn't feel my glutes activate. This means there's probably something wrong with my squat. These people, I would say, are almost the most often the people who self-sabotage themselves because they think, the priority for the lift itself is to have good technique, whereas the priority for the lift is to get the outcome of what that task is, which is to get stronger, express more force, and then to be more muscular, right? So if you can get stronger using that technique, and then you can increase the force that you're exerting using the technique, and you can gain muscularity with that technique, that by criteria means the technique is good enough. Whereas these guys, I've noticed a lot of these with like my engineering clients, sometimes my medicine clients, doctors, PAs, people like that, they may end up being technique guys. They will not increase the weight, generally because they think that technique criteria needs to be satisfied first. Vince, if you're watching this, shout out to you. This is all you. Interesting guy. He's a beekeeper. And then, these guys, they tend to not really get injured, or they do. It's kind of like a very hypervigilant thing. They're like, oh, I felt like a little creak in my lower back. It means I need to take a 2-week deload. Something like that. These people tend to fear injury and failure more than it actually happens. And then this acronym down here, this is like the you're not doing the program one, but Steph made this one kind of recently. I'm just going to work on technique and how this is a huge problem in programming. And it really is, right? Because with starting strength, we lay out, hey, here's this positive argument, positive meaning like constructed argument as to why to do the lifts in this specific way. And then people think that's kind of the most important thing. And they'll say, hey, if I'm not doing the lifts exactly this way, this means that nothing is going to work, right? And then what they'll do is they'll take light days, okay? They'll take light days. The worst I've seen it has been like, almost every Friday. And then what the person is doing is they'll do a normal Monday, Wednesday workout. They'll start feeling beat up by the time Friday comes around. And they'll be like, oh, there's no way I can do the technique correctly, which means Friday will turn into a light day. And what happens is the entire structure of the programming changes, right? So if you're artificially, lightening a day for really no reason, and they'll generally lighten it to such a severe degree. They may be squatting 275, but they're like, oh, I'm just going to go in and do a bunch of reps of 135. That way I'll groove in the technique. There's a few things with that. Because it's not heavy enough, it's not going to really be the same lift, right? In terms of like your mechanics, where the center of balance is, or it's going to be the center of mass is, all that stuff, So like the just going to work on technique guys, this is the sort of like squat university people. This is the, I don't want to say the Joel Seedman people, but kind of something like that. Anything that's like super biomechanical, and they'll be like, oh, I need to make sure my glute med is activated once I'm doing, this specific thing. Those guys, if you've ever heard yourself say anything about your glute med, really ever, you're probably in this camp. This isn't the worst thing to deal with or the worst person to be, because chances are you're probably not going to take a trip to Snap City. You're probably not going to tweak yourself, solely because you're probably sandbagging everything. That's not necessarily a bad thing. You'll probably get to a similar place in the long game. But there's going to be times where you have to train really hard and ignore your technique. So if I say someone like, hey, we're working on pulling 435 next week. This is your last deadlift session before that. I need you to pull 375 till you have one rep left in the tank. And I expect them to get, let's say, 5 reps, if that 435 is like a double, something like that. And then they get to rep 3, and they're like, if I do the next rep, that means my back is going to come out of extension, which means I can't do it. And then they end up training way less than they actually should. Right? There are expected form breakdowns, and then there are unnecessary form breakdowns. An expected form breakdown would be like, hey, I'm losing a little bit of back extension on the hardest deadlift reps. That's totally normal. It's totally expectable. Something that would be like a unwanted form breakdown would be like, hey, I'm really, constantly thinking about where the touch point is on my bench. And then instead of touching right here where it says Brazilian, I touched way down 2 inches below where it says Jiu-Jitsu. That would be like a form error, that is actually... it's critical enough, it has nothing to do with the weight itself, and that is something that would hamper progress. Whereas there's some things where it's like, hey, when I'm squatting and it's really heavy, my knees come in, on the ascent. You're like, hey, that's totally normal. The adductors, the inner thigh muscles are working really hard. So as they're helping to extend the hip, the knees pull in. Totally normal. But if you're someone who's like, hey, I can never let my knees come in on the squat because I think, my knees are going to explode or something like that, that's going to be a problem because you're only going to squat under 75% of what your true, relative max is if it's a 1RM, a 3RM, or a 5RM. That anecdote with Nick, we're back to Nick now. Married to the 3x5. This is the people who are like NLP for life. These people tend to be really reluctant to change, and they just kind of want to stick with the LP because you don't have to think about it. It's like, I remember hearing a really funny story in college. One of my friends was like trying 5-3-1, like Wendler's 5-3-1. And then he thought it meant you go in and you do a really hard set of 5, then you do a really hard triple, then you do a really hard single. And then that was the workout. And you do that for all the lifts, right? For him, that was like, oh, this is like a super simple model. I love this. I'll stick to 5-3-1. And it worked for a little bit, just like anything works for a little bit. But some people, they're really comforted by the 3x5 structure. And they'll be like, oh, I go in, I do my squats for 3x5, I do my bench for 3x5, my deadlift, if I do it at all, 1x5, 3x5, whatever. A lot of these people, they definitely didn't read the book. They definitely didn't read practical programming either. But you'll run into these people a lot. Like I would say, since getting on starting strength in 2020, I'd probably say 1 out of 4 people who reach out to me are probably in this sphere. They're like, oh, well, I've tried the NLP on and off for 3 years. And it's like, what does that mean? And then a lot of times it means the second point with constant layoffs and breaks. It's not like they were training Monday, Wednesday, Friday for that whole time. It's like they try and train for a month and a half. It gets really hard. They don't train for 2 months. They try it again. Then their kid got married, or then their kid went to college, or whatever, what have you. These people are constantly taking training breaks, which is a huge problem of its own. But this, for the sake of this talk, we're going to assume that everyone is lifting really reliably. But people who screw up their programming and they're really stuck to this 3x5, this is one of the big reasons. And there is a point where, if you've tried to input the same stimulus of this 3x5 4 times, you shouldn't do it again, right? Because, unless there was a 4-year break in between, that stimulus is getting less and less novel, and then you're getting less and less sensitive to it. So let's say if for 80% of your training career, you've been attempting to increase the 3x5 of your squat, and you take it up to 260, and then you deload and you go down to 200 again, then it's back up to 270, and then you're back down to 200. And then the more and more you keep doing that, the less and less effective it's going to get. These people, I would say, are actually very injury prone. And it's partially because of this overly high expectations things, and it's partially because of what I said before, right? So if we're doing basically the same thing over and over and over again, that's going to make us relatively more injury prone. Like if all you do is 1 rep max deadlifts, or all you do is 3 rep max deadlifts, or all you're ever doing is 3x5 squats, and they're like, oh man, everything's kind of feeling really creaky. Basically what happens is they'll run their SSNLP, they'll run the NLP correctly, they'll run it all the way up until it fails, and then they'll think they did something wrong, which is why it stopped working. And then they'll take a break or they'll deload or something like that. And then they're back to the start, right? And then a lot of that has to deal with overly high expectations, because there's all these sorts of, anecdotes of people running around who are like, oh, I got to a 450 squat, or I got to a 500-pound squat, or I got to a 375 squat on my NLP. And then this may be a guy who's like a standard deviation below the mean or a little bit more, but he's very stubborn. And then he's at 235 for his squat, but his NLP has no shit ended. And then he's just running it over and over again. That can cause a lot of problems. It really can. We'll talk about how to kind of coax people out of that, and then if it's yourself, how to sort of like switch your mindset on that. This can be a rough one, particularly because they think this is all I need. They'll be like, oh, this is really simple, and it will be really satisfying for themselves mentally, but it may not be what they need physiologically. So. These are the second guessers. This is almost the opposite of number 3. So if that's the group of people who are constantly doing the NLP, if they're like, hey, they're again people who've trained for 2 years, and then 90% of that time they've done some variation of the NLP. The second guessers are the people who I would say consume fitness media and content, for whatever that word means, the most. These are like the social media fitness fans. These people who are into biohacking. These are the people who are fucking listening to Peter Attia or Andrew Huberman, who are like, I wake up at 4 a.m. every day, I dip my balls in ice, I run for 3 miles, and then I rub sunscreen on my armpits, and then now I'm ready to, be a Navy SEAL for the rest of the day, whatever that is. A lot of these people, they tend to not stick with programming changes. Like, let's say if we have like a really refined scheme on the bench, and then I know at this rate with someone, we're probably going to be able to take a 5-pound PR on their 5x3 every 2 to 3 weeks, right? They won't even give it that time, that 2 to 3 weeks. They'll kind of expect things to work really immediately. Let's say your bench is, a little bit stuck, and then you need a little bit of a pit stop before getting your next 5x3 PR. PR for triples, just to make sure that's, sets into reps. And then they'll be like, okay, we're going to take a pit stop here. We're going to do some dips, or we're going to do some dumbbell bench, or we're going to do some this. And then they'll do it once. And they'll be like, oh, it didn't work. I was more sore the next day, or my bench didn't feel right the next time I did it, or anything like that. They'll expect very instant results and instant feedback. Whereas fitness as a whole is like a super long process. There's not really anything that you do that is you're going to do it once, really you're going to do it twice, or even under 5 times. That's going to be like an aha moment that's going to click. When you go to the starting strength seminars, there's going to be a lot of brand spanking new lifters for them, and then a lot of people who have lifting for like a pretty serious amount of time. If you've been lifting for like 2 years, and then you go and get some very direct coaching and counsels, they're essentially giving you advice on what to apply. They're not going to say, okay, I need you to think about this one cue, and then the lift like totally changes and you have this magical aha moment. But they may say, hey, your stance is asymmetrical, you're forgetting about your knees when you're on the ascent, you need to keep your elbows up in addition to keeping your chest up. And then those are like essentially chronic cues that you apply over the next 2 months of your life. And then that is what makes a difference in your programming. It makes a difference in your squat because of how it makes a difference in your programming because of how it impacts your squat. So when you change something in your programming, we're doing those sort of minimum effective changes. They take a really long time to show up. Okay. So it's like when you're doing from deadlifting 2 times a week to then doing deadlifting and rack pulling, you may not feel the benefits of that rack pull for like 4 weeks, maybe even 6, but you should still keep doing them because it's not necessarily about what you feel in the immediate point. It's more about how we're going to make these chronic changes to your programming. It'll really frustrate clients where I'll say like, hey, we need to let this ride for like 6 weeks before we even see what goes on. you know, and they'll be like 6 weeks. That's like a terribly long time. And you're like, okay, well, how long have you been lifting for? And they're like, okay, well, 6 years. And does 6 weeks really sound like a long time in the span of 6 years? Not really. And then I would say the other thing about this is a lot of people who fit into this category, this sort of second guesser category. What they'll end up doing is following different fads. They'll see like a new exercise variation on Instagram, or they'll see like, oh, the secret power of, you know, lying shrugs or prone shrugs on YouTube. And they're like, oh, I need these in my programming. I basically just got sold this exercise. It seems sick as hell. How can I, you know, use this? How can I incorporate the kettlebell swing into my programming to make sure that I can do all these things more coolly? I could be a better, you know, spear hunter. Those guys, they can really sabotage their own programming. As much as I said that the technique weenies really self-sabotage, they self-sabotage in a little bit of a different way. It's really just because they never do anything for long enough, you know. John, if you're out there skiing, John, Colorado John, I have a few Johns, so just calling John out specifically, this is him. Like, he wants to be good at like 5 different things. He'll see a lot of new things, new flashy things, and he'll like bring them back to me and be like, hey, this is really what we should be doing now. Whereas in reality, like, things, they take a while to mature. They take a while to bake in, you know. You need to think of learning the lifts and then understanding your own programming more of like a musical instrument, more than a parlor trick, you know. Like, you can't just do it once and then understand it. You're going to have to do it hundreds and hundreds of times, you know. So referring to the martial arts, referring to like sports, referring to instruments, things like that, they'll start making sense, you know. Like if I have someone who really loses control of their torso angle on the way down in the squat, and then, you know, let's say they lean over way too much and they fall onto their toes. And I'll say, hey, you know, we're going to do some front squats, or we're going to do some safety bar squats, good mornings, to kind of help you learn to control where your chest is in space a little bit more, right? It serves 2 functions for me. I can get some light quad work out of it. It's a lighter way to get some hamstring work to me, some quad work in the front squat. It's a lighter way to get some hamstring posterior chain work in that in the good morning, safety bar good morning. Those are really helpful tools just in terms of a programming aspect, but the skill development of helping your lifter to learn where to control their torso in space, that may take like 2 months for that to really kind of click for them, right? Because people develop their athletic skills really slowly. But for that guy, and you're saying, hey, here's why we're doing this, it's going to take a while to break in, they may be like 2 weeks into that process, and they'll be like, oh, I'm still having this problem in my barbell squat. You know, now an easy way to think about this or to retort against that is to say, well, you know, you should just be like coaching better in the primary lift itself. And it's like, that's totally true, but most human beings don't have a coach with them constantly. That's one of the really good things about the starting strength gyms, is that you're going to have a dude there with eyes on you who's going to be fixing all of your stuff, or trying to fix all of your stuff. Whereas for most human beings, myself included, we don't have coaches with us constantly. And then we're having to sort of get these or gain these athletic abilities very slowly over time. So if you're like a really seasoned squatter, and then every time you squat, you know, when you get to the sticking point, you screw up because your upper back kind of collapses, but you feel like you have more horsepower in your legs, right? Then you may have to think, all right, what can I be doing and be focusing on to make sure that I don't have that same exact failure pattern? And then that's where some of these variations can come in. If you're one of these people, if you're one of the second guessers, riding those variations out, that may be really rough for you. This is where I'd say these people kind of need to learn the most patience. And then we'll finish it up with number 5. This is probably going to be most people walking around. Like if you go into a bank and you find all the middle-aged people working there, sorry, no shade if you're working in a bank and listening to this right now on your second monitor. But if you, let's say if we go into an accounting firm, something like that, and then we pull all of those people and say, hey, who's ready to get jacked as hell? We'll be like, hey, who's ready to get lean? Yay. Who's ready to try really hard and lift heavy weights? You know, it's the Ronnie Coleman quote. People think they're much more sensitive than they are. And then second that, you know, even if they've already started the journey, they'll think that feeling irritation is in itself bad and it indicates that something is wrong. Justin, shout out to you on this one. They'll be like, hey, like my shoulder's hurting after I bench press. And it's like, okay, you know, are you alive to never feel any discomfort, or are you alive to get what you want out of the lifts? And then if sometimes pain happens, that's totally fine. You know, it's like I'm deadlifting, understanding that I'm going to tweak my back occasionally deadlifting. I'm not deadlifting to avoid lower back tweaks completely. Because, you know, if my primary goal is to avoid pain and injury, I'm probably just going to, you know, like be in a float tank, Joe Rogan float tank, doing, you know, morphine or something like that. That's kind of how I'll minimize that. That's not really what we're doing. We got to figure out what we're optimizing for. So for a lot of these people, they may be really focused on going to work the next day. They're like, okay, well, I got to mow the lawn in 2 days. I can't really deadlift this heavy right now because like I have to pick the lawnmower up and put it in the back of the truck, right? Like if I screw up this deadlift and then that screws up me mowing the lawn, like my whole week is shot, something like that. So for these people, you kind of have to take a more gentle approach to programming, which is totally fine. It just kind of extends your time horizon. But you will slowly have to give them challenges that they can overcome. And then as they overcome those challenges, they'll start slowly chipping away at this. Out of all of them, go back to this big list here. The people who are fearing failure and injury, that's something that people can slowly learn out of. They'll do it for 3 months. They'll be like, oh man, it'd be crazy if one day I could pick up 200 pounds. That's like 4 bags of concrete. That'd be crazy. And then they do that in like 2 months. And they're like, oh wow, okay, I'm actually much stronger and more resilient than I think I am. Number 5 can really be accommodated. It can be accommodated in programming. And then people very often fight their way out of that hole. The second guessing changes, guys, this tends to be something that really kind of colors someone's training career. If they've done a bunch of things for a year, but they've never become a master at one thing and done it for 10 years, you're probably dealing with number 4. That's kind of like a lifetime thing, or at least what I've seen. The married to 3x5 people, once they, kind of take the they live sunglasses off, or put them on, depending on which way you want to do that one. Once they kind of see what the broader world of programming is, a lot of times they'll be like, hey, I totally get it. I really should not have been sticking on the NLP for 2 years. This is something that once they're out of that hole, they're out of it and they never go back. The thinking it's technique people, I would say this is more like number 4. This is one of those things that people will do, or this is someone that person will be, and they'll probably be that way for a long time. You can kind of talk someone out of this over a lengthy period of time, and then you, the lifter, if you're noticing that you're a technique weenie, and then you're like, hey, I haven't really done anything hard in 6 months because I'm trying to like find the perfect back angle on my squat. Maybe one day you'll kind of have an aha moment and then realize the technique is not super duper important. I'm not sure where it came up with initially, but you want to be able to have like A+ form when it's like an 80% weight. When you're doing anything like 90-95%, if you're doing something really hard, you're looking for B+. You're looking for someone to see it and then say, hey, that looks like a really good squat. But if someone really watches it, they'll find things to nitpick. That's kind of the balance point that you want to find in terms of technique. In terms of greed, I think this is much more like number 3. When someone is exposed to good programming, number 1 totally fades away, because they'll kind of understand what happens more. If you talk to someone who's like pretty seasoned into like natural bodybuilding or something like that, and then you'll ask them what, like, let's pick something silly, like their dumbbell overhead press, their dumbbell seated press is, and they'll be like, oh, I can 70 pounds for, 13 reps. And you'd be like, hey, how long do you think it's going to take you to get your dumbbell seated press from 70 for 13 to 70 to, let's say, 17? They'd probably tell you like a year and a half. No shit. They may tell you literally a year and a half, and that would be pretty accurate. And that's not a bad thing. That's just someone who's like an advanced athlete who kind of understands themselves and they understand where they are in the scheme of progress. When people are really new, they'll kind of be a mix of all 5 of these, but a lot of times they'll be predominantly number 1. They'll be like, hey, I went from a 1 to 300 pound squat in 6 months. That means 500 pounds. I should be able to get that next fucking year. And they don't really realize that's something that's like it could be a multi-year project, So we'll go over this next time. Other things I'd like to recommend, go back and watch our strength expectations for normal people, for normal human beings, whatever the episode title is called there. This will kind of give you a good handle on normal rates of progress and what we can do in terms of rate of gain. And then maybe a few days from now, we'll find out. We'll see what this guy does. We're going to go over more about how to actually determine if you're being greedy in terms of programming. So we're going to I think I'm probably going to pull samples from like 5 or 6 of my clients, and we'll go through actual examples of say, hey, this is Phil. Phil's stuck at like a 225 bench. This is Zach. He's stuck at, like close to a 405 deadlift, and then so on. And we'll go through, hey, how do I take that from 405 to 410 and 225 to 230? We're going to do a bunch of examples exactly like that. Make sure, reach out on the website if you're looking for some coaching in the DC area, if you're looking for online coaching. All I do is programming. I teach judo, I teach wrestling, I teach jiu-jitsu, I do programming, and I coach people. That's it. I think about this stuff when I go to bed at night, and think about it sometimes when I wake up in the middle of the night and then in the morning as well. That's about it. I think that's it for everything. Yeah, there's Chase's Instagram. Follow that up. Oh yeah, if you want videos on the show, I know Adam, Martin, and Byron. They are doing form check videos, and if you want form checks on the show, send those into support at strength.club. So if you watch this far, thank you. Send some videos in, and then those guys will get through them for you as a thank you. Bye.